All right, Shane. So let's kick it over now to our interview with Stefan Krajisnik from the Clarion Ledger.
Say that 10 times fast.
No, he told me how to say it. I still butchered it. I'm probably gonna have to fix this in editing. You know what?
Thank God Bob Kessling ain't here.
Hey, we're pleased for the first time to be joined by Stefan Krajisnik, who covers Mississippi State for the Clarion Ledgers. And you know that name well if you're in that state. Stefan just started up with the Clarion Ledger, but he's been covering Mississippi State athletics for a while now. Stefan, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. Looking forward to talking some football. It feels like it's so far away, but it's creeping up on us.
Yeah, no doubt. And I wanted to ask you because I'm sure you're well aware of this. From what I read up on you, you're an Indiana grad, and for whatever reason, Indiana is like the pipeline to SEC reporters here. So you probably knew what you were yourself into when you came down to Starkville to cover the Bulldogs. But did you realize how big this Mississippi State Ole Miss rivalry was going to be till you got down here?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm sure you've spoken to Ben Portnoy before, and he covers South Carolina now, and he kind of had a job here with the Commercial Dispatch covering Mississippi State. So he was kind of the point man on making sure I knew all things coming in, and you can imagine I've experienced rivalries and stuff. The Indiana Purdue basketball rivalry is huge every year. And I figured the Ole Miss Mississippi State football rivalry was huge just because the Egg Bowl being usually on Thanksgiving has given a great platform for that rivalry to kind of shine like all over the country because it's the only college football game on. So like, growing up, even in Indiana, I was tuned into the Egg Bowl because what else would you watch unless you were, super avid NFL fan, watching that night. And with at least for my lifetime, the Cowboys are usually in that late spot, and nobody really wants to watch that anyway. So, but it was really awesome this past weekend. To watch the baseball rivalry. You figure rivals, it can be any sport, and Mississippi State fans want to beat Ole Miss, but I really never understood the magnitude of how big college baseball was in the SEC until I got here. And then obviously, this particular rivalry, it's huge. Like people care a lot, and I've never seen college baseball to that, on that platform before. So that was really cool to see. And I know people bicker back and forth in the rivalry, but I think at the end of the day, I think there's a great deal of respect between the two schools when it comes to the competitive nature and what, they've, both sides have kind of been capable of making, these rivalries become.
Yeah, and not only are you, thrown right into the middle of this rivalry, you're thrown into covering one of the most unique characters, not only in college football, but really in all sports. What's it like covering Mike Leach on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I always tell people that the day-to-day stuff is not, a lot like what you see on the viral clips. There's a lot of times where he probably doesn't feel like doing a media availability or doesn't feel like answering a question or things of that nature. But he's a good time to work with, and at the end of the day when he steps off the podium or whatnot, you're gonna get a decent amount of time to just talk to him on the side about literally anything you want to talk about. I mean, he's a funny guy, and that like any coach, the relationship with reporters is what it is. There's days where coaches don't feel like doing press conferences and days they do, but overall it's been a fun experience. I've enjoyed covering him. I've gotten a chance to, talk to him about non-football related stuff that it's really interesting. And I've always told everyone, his viral clips about candy corn and his thoughts on weddings and things like that. Like those are the clips that get millions of views and people laugh at that and think he's, just some funny guy, but he's a really smart guy and he's really fun to talk about. He's traveled everywhere and it's really cool to talk about that. He graduated from law school. Like he's a really smart guy who knows a lot of things. And that's, what I've always found more interesting and more entertaining than those, viral moments and funny things that he says, though, those rants are pretty iconic in their own way.
Now, let me ask you this because circling to his football team, Mississippi State, you think they're being a little bit slept on because obviously had they had a better kicker, I mean, they may have been a 10-win team last season. Coming into this year, they're going to host Texas A&M, which they beat, Arkansas, which questionable call could have beat them, and you're also hosting Auburn. So, just looking at the schedule, looking at the team they're bringing back, I have a high opinion on Mississippi State. But do you think nationally the Bulldogs are being slept on a little bit?
I think so, and I think it really did surprise me seeing a lot of I mean, first you have the way too soon rankings that come out the day after the championship game, which is to me is kind of relevant at this point with how the transfer portal is, right? Like how like there's just no way to predict anything. But on top of that, even as even as the rankings have kind of progressed, it is surprising to not see Mississippi State in a lot of those top 25s. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily a top 10 team going into the season, but I definitely thought they were going to be a top 25 team in most accounts because of what they return. And obviously losing Makai Polk and Charles Cross and Martin Emerson, those are big losses. But I feel like aside from left tackle will be a little bit iffy, especially when you're trying to replace a guy who's probably going to go in the top 10 on Thursday, right? But Makai Polk, I think they're not going to have too much trouble replacing just because of the depth that they have at wide receiver, as any Mike Leach air raid offense tends to do. And with Emmanuel Forbes there, you kind of have him to just step into that number one corner role. And they've got a few guys who are capable of being that number two guy. So their biggest losses, I feel like they have replacements for. So you look at what they return and what they're capable of replacing. I think it's a pretty good team. What's tough for them is the schedule that they get handed. You mentioned those 3 games that they have at home, which are very winnable. But at the same time, you get to play Georgia this year in that cross divisional game, right? Like you went from playing Vanderbilt last year, you're playing Georgia this year, so that's kind of unfavorable. And they're playing at Kentucky, and I've seen various reports. Andy Koska, who was at the Clear and Ledger before, I took the job recently, reported that by some accounts they have the toughest schedule in the nation coming into next season. Now, obviously, that changes, with the portal and things like that. But overall, you can see how hard it is. It's not too much of a surprise that someone in the SEC West has that. But when you take the SEC West and you add Georgia, you're going to have the hardest schedule. That's just how it's going to work out. And they got to take advantage of the non-conference games. They got to put themselves in a good position. They didn't do that last year, particularly with that loss at Memphis. And everyone remembers that controversial punt return and all that. But at the end of the day, that's probably a game they should have ran away with. You can't really mess around in the non-conference. You got to get your feet wet right away, solidify that offensive line. So like any team, they've got holes. But to go back to your question, I do think they're being slept on a little bit because I think they can be one of the better teams in the SEC West.
Now, is there a question mark, maybe the biggest question mark that you had for this football team going into spring camp that you think they got answered? Is it that left tackle position? Is it another one? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the one that did the best job of addressing and I guess clearing any doubt of is replacing Makai Polk. They've had Caleb Duckin, who's going to be a redshirt senior and really hasn't shown that production, but he's got the size, and if he can just be consistent, he can be really good and kind of step into that role. But alongside what we've seen in history with Mike Leach offenses is there's rarely that Makai Polk. There's usually a plethora of guys who come in and add up to those 105 receptions. You don't have one guy who's just going to go get those receptions. And I think they're in a better position for that this year. I think their wide receiver group is just, less top heavy. I think it's a pretty spread out group where you can have a few guys. And if you're demanding, Caleb Duckin to go out there and get you 50 and 60 catches, that's reasonable. Again, asking him to get 105 might not be reasonable. I think when you spread that out, they did a good job of addressing, that question of Kai Polk leaving. The left tackle spot, they've tried Katrevius Johnson, people call him Dollar Bill around here, a left tackle. He was mostly a right guard most of the last season. So moving him at left tackle is interesting. They bring in Percy Lewis, a JUCO guy who I believe was the number 2 JUCO player available in this year's signing class. Or he's a really highly rated guy, huge guy. Like you look at him, you're like, well, yeah, that's who you want at left tackle. But he's obviously still making that transition in spring of becoming an SEC ready guy coming in from JUCO. So left tackle will be interesting, but I think this spring they've done a great job of addressing at least that outside wide receiver room.
Now, Mississippi State's also had a couple spring scrimmages that they've opened to the public. I know the quote unquote spring game was supposed to be that way, but the weather didn't cooperate. Any intel or observations that you've gathered from the open scrimmages that Mississippi State's had this spring?
Yeah. So the way they've structured it is they've had 3 open scrimmages, and they weren't having a traditional spring game this year. They tried not to even call it that. They were just kind of calling it a spring scrimmage. So the one that got rained out, they had the week before the original scheduled one, they just had a typical Saturday scrimmage that was open to the public. The following week it gets rained out, so they just moved that to Tuesday. So they had a Tuesday scrimmage, and they're going to have one on tonight, Tuesday night. for kind of their last practice / last scrimmage. So that's the way they've structured it with practices kind of coming in between those. The one thing that I've really taken away from it is they have a really deep front six defensively. And we haven't seen a lot of that in the spring just because guys like Jordan Davis is still coming back. From a torn ACL, we didn't see him at all last season, and that's a guy that people thought would be Mississippi State's top defensive end. Guys like Jaden Crumity have been kind of limited in the spring. Jed Johnson fractured his hand and has been out most of the spring. That's going to be a starting linebacker. But with all those injuries, they had a few young guys like Deshaun Page, a linebacker, who have really stepped up and looked good in those scrimmages. So suddenly you think, well, when they get those big guys back, in the fall, they've got a pretty deep front six, and that was their strength last season because, and I think it still will be, because safety is still an iffy position that Mississippi State was among the best defenses when it came to stopping the run, and that helped their secondary out a lot, and maybe some of those holes in the safety position didn't show because of how good they were up front. So if they have a deep room there and they can just rotate guys in and get fresh guys in, there's no reason to believe that at least top rush defense can't return and help the pass defense out a little bit, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's so much star power at the quarterback position in the SEC returning. Well, of course, we got the reigning Heisman Trophy winner. We got other guys that are listed all over the preseason Heisman Trophy odds. So it may be a stretch to say Will Rogers is the best quarterback just because of how loaded they are at that position in the conference. But, what are the odds that he's the most productive? I don't think that's a stretch at all, considering what we've seen from him and what we know. We all know the prolific offenses Mike Leach puts together. What are the odds that Will Rogers is the most productive, and you can define that however you want, most productive quarterback in the SEC this year?
I think the odds on that are pretty good. And, you mentioned there the Heisman odds. When I checked, and this was like January, like right after the season had ended, they had like the way too early, Heisman odds or the immediate Heisman odds. I think it was FanDuel that had him. And Will Rogers was ninth. So I think there's definitely some national hype around him. And I think what we've seen, or at least what we saw last season, was he went from a guy in the first half of the year who was putting up ridiculous numbers because of the Mike Leach offense. He was throwing it a ton. He was completing a ton of passes. A lot of them were just, kind of dump offs and, that chunk yardage that they get in the air raid offense. It wasn't necessarily big plays downfield, but he was getting a ton of yards, completing passes, getting touchdowns. His numbers looked really good, but you still felt like there was a next step to his game. And I think we really saw that as the season progressed. Like he struggled in the Egg Bowl and he struggled a lot in the Liberty Bowl. But in those games leading up to that, like the people that watched that Auburn game and saw the flip that Mississippi State made from being down 23 to, like people are surprised that, they came back and they won that game and it was this huge comeback. But I don't know the last time I've, at least in person, seen a quarterback take over the game, like that. Like we've seen great performances. Like, Bryce Young has taken over games, right? Like we've seen that. But for me to watch it live and to just like, it wasn't like you get teams that come back and then you get that like final drive. It's huge. Like Mississippi State was down like 28-17. And you're like, they're going to win this game just because of how dominant like Will Rogers looked. Like he was just slicing up that defense. He was finding every hole in that defense, finding the space, finding the grass that you need in the air raid. And you saw, that was just a perfect game of seeing how he's learned this offense in his time working with Mike Leach. And you really saw him going from a system quarterback to a guy who knows how to run that system. Like it wasn't the system suiting him. It was him, kind of knowing what to do and being, and Mike Leach talked about it. Like Will Rogers got to a point last season where he was at the line, calling plays, calling audibles, things of that nature. And for Mike Leach to, give someone the reins to do that, that means he has a lot of trust in that quarterback. And he usually doesn't have guys as young as Will Rogers. And he kept saying last season, like, listen, like, I know he started a lot of games as a true freshman, so people are just used to seeing him out there. But like at the end of the day, he's only had about a season and a half's worth of starts. And I know people will be like, well, look at Bryce Young, like all this and that. He doesn't have the talent and the athleticism that a Bryce Young has. Like that, like most quarterbacks take some time to develop. They're not all Bryce Young and Trevor Lawrence's and Deshaun Watson's, right? Like they take some time to develop. And you're seeing that with Will Rogers. And he's been spoken highly of this spring. Leach has spoken highly of him. And I think it's very reasonable to put high expectations on him this season. And I think he knows that. And he puts that pressure on himself. And he talks about, kind of being a veteran now and feeling like he's been at Mississippi State for 6 or 7 years as opposed to like 3. But the expectations are there for himself. And I think it's kind of starting to build on a national stage, especially if Mississippi State can win some games early next season.
What's the biggest question mark you have exiting the spring for the defense? Because I think Zach Arnett, I didn't know hardly anything about him when Mississippi State hired him, but I think he's been tremendous. You reference it; they've really attacked the run defense. They've been that way since Zach Arnett's been there. They've had star power in the secondary, and they got that once again in Emmanuel Forbes. So, what's the biggest question mark you have for this Zach Arnett defense that they'll have to take that next step if Mississippi State's going to truly contend in the West?
Yeah, I think the safety position is the biggest thing. And what's interesting there is that in the offseason, Mississippi State did a lot of reshuffling with the coaching staff, and it put Zach Arnett in charge of coaching the safeties specifically. And that's a position that he's going to have to harp on and get fixed because, at corner, they got to develop a number 2 corner, right? Like someone's got to step up and take the place of Forbes while Forbes takes the place of Emerson, which I think they could do. And now then it just leaves it to the safety position. And Jalen Green came over from Texas last season. He was a corner at Texas, moved to safety, and he did a pretty good job. So now you got to look at who's going to step up behind him. Obviously, they have Colin Duncan, who's a super experienced guy. But you never have really seen that kind of next step in his game. He really kind of needs to take that next step and be a leader and kind of put his foot down at the safety position, be like, hey, I can be a guy who can be trusted back here. And I'm not sure if we saw that yet this spring from him, and that's kind of hard to gauge, in practices. But even in those scrimmages, you're still kind of waiting for him to make that big play. And what's interesting there is that they bring in Jackie Matthews, a transfer from West Virginia, I believe it was, who had a pick 6 at one of the scrimmages and has looked pretty flashy in some of those spots. So it'll be interesting to see if he develops in a guy and maybe steals some snaps from Colin Duncan. And then kind of in that, I put it in the safety category, that bulldog, that position that they have. I think some schools call it like a husky. Like there's various names that I've heard for it, but they're losing Fred Peters at that position. It looks like Sean Preston Jr. is going to be the guy, at least for right now, who they want to step in there. That's another guy, kind of like Colin Duncan, where he's got experience, but like you're waiting, like you want that next step to come, and it just kind of seems like it hasn't yet. So that those 2 guys, Colin Duncan, Sean Preston, and their positions, I think are still biggest question marks, at least defensively, coming out of the spring.
Now, unfortunately, I mean, this is just the state of college football. We always got to talk transfer portal and who's coming and who's going. So I know Mississippi State's added a couple guys, but if they were to add, 1 or 2 more, what position groups do you think they will target to bring someone in to shore up any deficiencies they have?
Yeah, I think, and Mike Lee just talked about it. At least he did during one of the signing days. It's so confusing now with all the signing days to which one's which. But he talked a lot about how the thing with the portal is you don't really stop once spring starts, right? Like the portal is about to take like another push right now that spring ball is finishing, and teams know kind of what they need or have at least a little bit of a better picture of it. I think offensive line is still going to be a spot where Mississippi State's going to look to add depth, and who knows, maybe even go get someone who's solidified at left tackle. If there's a big name out there, you can look at Percy Lewis, the JUCO guy coming in, and you can look at Petrivius Johnson and the work he's putting over there and say, listen, you guys are great and we'll develop you, but this guy's immediate and we got a chance at him. We're going to bring him in and put him there. So I think that's one thing to watch out. It could be really at either of the tackle positions, because right tackle is not really solidified either with Scott Lashley out of eligibility there. And then defensively, I think we're going to see some more additions in the secondary. And I'm totally slipping on his name right now, but they just got a former 4-star defensive back coming in from Florida State the other day who committed, and
Marcus Washington.
Right. So they're bringing in Washington, and so they've got good pieces there right now. But I think what they need, as I mentioned it with Colin Duncan and Sean Preston and Emmanuel Forbes probably leaving for the NFL next year, like they've got really good pieces right now, but you look at that group and you're like, that's kind of an old group with not a lot of young guys who are ready to step in. So they needed a guy like that to come in from Florida State and give them 3 or 4 years of eligibility to maybe not make an immediate impact, but give them some kind of foundation in the secondary for the years moving forward. So I wouldn't be surprised if they went out and got a couple more guys like that who, were highly rated players out of high school, maybe just didn't fit, at their current schools, things like that. Bring them in, tell them, hey, you're probably not going to play this year or not play much this year. Let us develop you. And then when Forbes and Duncan and Preston are gone, and even Jalen Green, you'll be ready to step in next season. So looking at that would be the 2023 season.
All right, last question for you. I really appreciate all your time. Mike Leach, unfortunately, hey, the guy he replaced was undefeated in the Egg Bowl. Mike Leach is still searching for his first Egg Bowl. I'm not trying to push Leach out the door because I love him. I hope he's in the SEC forever. But how much pressure is going to be on Mike Leach to win that Egg Bowl, even though it is in Oxford this year?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of pressure, and I think there's a lot of pressure because people don't know what Ole Miss is going to look like, right? Like, how do they look replacing a ton of key players who are leaving for the NFL? Like, I don't think the expectations are that high, at least nationally, on Ole Miss, and that's going to push for people believing, hey, this is the year that you got to go in there, and you got to steal a win on the road and bring the Egg Bowl back to Starkville, and there's pressure, and I've had this discussion a million times with various people of like, how do you balance what was a really good season last year for Mississippi State and a huge step forward in year 2 under Mike Leach? How do you balance that with losing the Egg Bowl again? And there's a lot of people who are like, listen, if he loses it this year, he's on the hot seat. Like, and I was like, even if he wins like 11, like if he goes 11-1 and loses to Ole Miss, they're like, yeah, you can't go 0-3 in the Egg Bowl and be safe around here. So that's, I mean, it's whether you think it's right or wrong, it's how a lot of people think, right? Like, there's a lot of Thanksgivings that people get together, and part of the family's an Ole Miss fan, a part of the family's a State fan, and it determines how that Thanksgiving night goes. So there's pressure, and Leach probably knows it, and he probably he won't talk about it. And he'll say he's worried about consistency and taking it one game at a time. And when Ole Miss comes around, it'll be about winning a football game and not about winning some huge Egg Bowl. But he knows, and people around Mississippi State know that if you start off 0-3 in the Egg Bowl, you better be winning 11 games because otherwise people get mad and what comes with that.
All right, so he's Stefan Krajisnik. I hope I nailed that.
Krajisnik, close enough. You had the first time, so that's all we asked for.
I really, really appreciate all this Mississippi State knowledge and for you taking this time. You did an outstanding job. I think my listeners are really, really going to appreciate this one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on, and anytime you want me on, in the summer and the season, let me know, man. I got time for you.
All right, so just want to say thanks to Stefan for joining the show. Some outstanding coverage here on the Mississippi State Bulldogs. I hope you Bulldog fans, I keep hearing it. Hell, I hear it from every fan base, Shane, but Mississippi State fans are definitely there. Give us more coverage of Mississippi State, so I hope you appreciated that. I have 2 other guests lined up for the next episode, so hey, we got plenty of coverage coming your way before the NFL draft, and of course, we'll have something special planned for that. But you got anything before we get out of here, brother?
Man, how did we not mention the Florida hat toss? I mean, come on, Mike. For how many years has a Tennessee hat or a Tennessee shirt been ripped and all this? Usually we are the butt of the joke when it comes to recruiting. And I know we haven't talked that much about recruiting, but man, it was nice not seeing a Tennessee hat flung in the audience, wasn't it?
Yeah, if anybody doesn't know what Shane's talking about, 4-star safety Sylvester Smith, number 11 safety prospect in the country, committed to Tennessee on Tuesday. The Vols, Shane, number 7 recruiting class in the country right now. It's a tremendous job by Josh Heupel and company, but he picked up that Florida hat, probably gave Heupel a little bit of a heart attack before he threw it, like you said, and he and the family revealed all their Tennessee gear. So, yeah, it's got to feel nice to be on the other end of that one, huh?
Yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, I just had to bring that up because, like I said, I've seen everything else. I've seen jerseys ripped and parents mad at the kids. It's nice to see something go our way for once. But no, brother, that's all I've got.
Well,
fantastic.
Hey, Shane, let me say this though.
Yeah,
you want to. There's that, and then if you've seen it, the baseball team apparently, broke into the Florida locker room, was wearing all the Florida helmets. I mean, my goodness, Tennessee's they're asking for trouble with the damn the jinx of the Gators coming to town this year, aren't they?
No, they're not. And I'm going to tell you why, Mike, because this is a rivalry that kind of went away for a little bit, and I feel like it's heating back up. So yeah. I love it. Florida wants us. We want Florida. So it's shaping up. It's going to be a hell of a matchup, and this is what it's all about, brother. I mean, all season already taken. I mean, we got the baseball team sneaking in the locker room wearing those helmets. Now, I did see a lot of people saying, a lot of Gator fans saying they were just living their dream, since they didn't get a scholarship offer. So they trust me, they threw it back at us. But no, I love it, man. This is what it's all about, and I'm ready. I'm ready for college football. We were just talking a few hours ago about we're right around the corner from the 100-day countdown, and it feels like when we start that 100-day countdown, college football's cranking up sooner than later. So about a month away, brother.
Yeah, I can't wait for it, Shane. So I appreciate you as always. I cannot wait to get down to this countdown. Like you said, we're about as of this podcast, 129 days college football kicking off. But man, we could sit here and talk about it for hours, I feel like, but I got to let you go, get you in some quality time with the family. But I do appreciate it, as always, Shane, and I appreciate each and every one of you that keeps tuning in. We'll catch you on the next one.
All right. See you guys. Go Vols.
You need any help pronouncing my name or anything like that?
Yeah, that'd be what I was going to do. What I do is I just go fast. That way you can't correct me, but yeah, go for it.
It's Stefan Krajisnik.
Krajisnik.
Yep.
Okay. Stefan Krajisnik.
Yep.
Okay. See, I told you if I go fast, people won't even notice. All right.
You're good.